Well, hello and welcome to week 13 of the course. There are only 2 more weeks after this, so keep going to the finish line. We've got the majority of the course behind us, but we still have some interesting material on the way. I hope this video works out because my 3-year-old daughter is watching a movie on Netflix, and I think that will distract her for enough time for me to give this lecture. But she may make a cameo appearance at some time, so we'll just have to wait and see about that. So this week is really not all about Beowulf, but almost all about Beowulf. You do have some readings in Art Across Time. I don't think those are substantial enough to require a video on my part. So both of the videos this week are going to be about Beowulf. And I want you to go ahead and make sure you have available and accessible some of the handouts that I put on Canvas for the week. I've got a timeline of British history, which I'll refer to at some point. Today, we'll talk about this map, the map of the world of Beowulf, and also some poetic devices in Beowulf. So have those handy, do whatever you need to do, pause it, whatever. So we're going to talk about a number of different facets of Beowulf, but I just want to point out from the very beginning that Beowulf raises some of the same questions that we've already seen dealt with in literature this semester. In a way, Beowulf is trying to answer the question, how do you honor your ancestors when you cannot, for whatever reason, follow in their path? I think in many ways, this is the question of the Aeneid, and I think it's the question that haunts Beowulf as well. So in this video, I'm going to be kind of introducing or just giving you some orientation. You know, what is this poem? Who wrote it? When? Where? Some of those kinds of basic questions. And then in the subsequent video, I'll get to some of the more difficult interpretive questions that arise when reading Beowulf. So let's start with the date. Okay? Let's start first of all with the time period in which the poem is set. Okay. A lot of scholars think that the character Beowulf, who is sort of this legendary figure, was probably supposed to have lived at some point in the 6th century CE. And we're well out of BCE now. So he's living in a time after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, probably around the 6th century. The other question that has to be addressed is, well, when was the poem actually written? It was not written in the 6th century. This should come as no surprise, because Beowulf is an epic, and there's a tendency in epics to set the action in a far-off, distant time period. And so I think we see this here as well. At the very earliest, this poem was written in the 7th century, so probably at least 100 years after the time in which the poem is set, but it's likely, I think, that the poet was writing even later than that. And not only that, but it's also likely that the story was handed down orally for a long time before the poet sort of adapted it and wrote it down. We know that at the absolute latest, it was written sometime in the 10th century. We know this because we possess only one manuscript of Beowulf. So had that manuscript been lost, we would never be able to read Beowulf. And that manuscript comes from about 1000 CE. So we know it had to have been written by that time at the very latest, probably a good bit earlier than that. So let's just say 8th, 9th century. That's probably the most likely time. Well, let's talk a little bit about the geographical setting for a moment. This poem is going to take us to a part of the world that we really haven't visited up to this point in the course, and that is Scandinavia. We've, of course, talked about the Germanic peoples who end up infiltrating the Roman Empire. We know that ultimately the Germanic people seem to have come from Scandinavia, but we haven't talked much about Scandinavia itself. So this is the time to go ahead and get out that map, the map of the world of Beowulf, so you can kind of familiarize yourself with that landscape. So this is what would today be, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and so on. So Beowulf himself is one of the Geats. You can see the Geats here in what is now southern Sweden. But this is not where the author of the poem is from. The author of the poem is from England. So this raises a question. Why would a writer in England be writing about events that happened centuries before in Scandinavia? How do we make sense of that? Well, it's actually pretty easy to make sense of it if you understand the historical context. And here I would direct you to the timeline that I uploaded. And what you'll see there is between the years 450 and 600, two main Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, begin to immigrate to what is now called England. England is named after these people, comes from the Angles, England, that's how we get the name. And often these people are simply referred to as the Anglo-Saxons because their cultures were quite similar to begin with, and they end up sort of creating one common culture in England that we call Anglo-Saxon culture. This is forever going to change the course of England's history, and indeed, as I just suggested, it creates England in a very real sense. So I think now we can understand why this English poet is writing about Scandinavians who lived maybe several hundred years before him. He's writing about his ancestors. And of course, people, even today, get really obsessed and preoccupied with their ancestors. Think about Ancestry.com and all the DNA kits that you can do today to see where your ancestors came from. So I think we can understand this. I think we can understand why the poet would have been fascinated by his ancestors. So at any rate, back to this setting, everything takes place in what is now Scandinavia. And I think we really get the sense when we read Beowulf that we are entering into foreign territory, new territory. Let's not forget that Scandinavia was never a part of the Roman Empire. And indeed, when you read Beowulf, you just don't get much of a sense that this is a culture that has been influenced by Roman culture at all. This is a kind of purely Germanic culture that we're dealing with. All right. I also want to talk about a not unrelated question, the question of language. We are reading a translation of Beowulf, and if you're using the edition that was assigned, if you're not, it's not the end of the world, but I hope that most of you were able to use this. If you get this, that becomes clear because you can open any page and you'll see something quite easily readable on the right-hand page and some gobbledygook on the left-hand page. So what's that all about? Well, in a sense, we could say that Beowulf was written in another language, but that's only partly true, because Beowulf was written in the language that is sometimes simply called Anglo-Saxon, but also sometimes called Old English. So Beowulf was written in an early form of the language that we speak right now. And this is why, by the way, that the English language is considered a Germanic language, because this is where it originally comes from. if you look over the left-hand page, you can occasionally recognize a word or two, but it is a very different kind of language. Now I want you to look at that handout, Poetic Devices and Poetic Devices in Beowulf. I want to talk about Anglo-Saxon poetry. This is the earliest work of Anglo-Saxon poetry that we have, and it has a lot of typical features of Anglo-Saxon poetry. So let's look at some of them. The first is kennings, K-E-N-N-I-N-G-S. What is a kenning? A kenning is a metaphor that is created by simply combining two words. A couple of examples here. Bone house. It's a simple compound word, bone house, meaning body. So bone house is a kenning for body. Joy wood, a kenning for the harp. Made out of wood, it gives joy. Wave vat, a kenning for the ocean. The ocean is like a huge vat made up of waves. Okay? So be looking for these. You'll see them every so often in Beowulf. And this is a characteristic Anglo-Saxon device. You'll also see that Anglo-Saxon poetry has a very distinctive meter as well. Every line is divided into two half lines. You don't really see that in the modern English translation, but if you look over, again, anywhere at the actual Old English, you'll see that each line is divided into two units. Okay? And what connects the units together is alliteration, which I'll come to in a second. Each half line has two stressed syllables. Two stressed syllables. It'll have more syllables than two. Two stressed syllables. And then either the first stressed syllable or both stressed syllables of the first half line must alliterate with the first stressed syllable of the second half line. Okay? Alliteration means that you've got the same consonant sound. Okay? I'll give you some examples in just a moment. You'll also note that the final stressed syllable of the line should never alliterate. So these are some rules that the Beowulf follows quite closely. You can see an example here of alliteration under other poetic devices. This is an example from Emily Dickinson. The cricket sang and set the sun. Sang, set, sun. All those syllables are stressed, and they all begin with the same consonant sound. I also, just for good measure, threw in a couple of other poetic devices here as well. These are just good things to be looking for or listening for in any kind of poetry. Anglo-Saxon, yes, but other kinds of poetry as well. We've got assonance, which is similar in some ways to rhyme. It's the repetition of a vowel sound in stressed syllables that are close together. So here's one from Shakespeare: times scythe. Okay, not quite a rhyme, but we've got the same stressed vowel syllable, that I sound. Times scythe. And then we've got consonants, which is a bit like alliteration, but a little bit different. It has to do with the consonant sound at the end of stressed syllables that are close together. Extended wand. They both end with that nd sound. Okay? They don't rhyme, but they call attention to each other. Okay? And we can see a number of these if we look at just one example, and you could really choose almost any line at random in Beowulf, but I think a particularly good one can be found very early. So if you look at page 11, if you have a different edition, look around line, this would be, let's see, 122. Okay, but it's page 11, line 122 in my edition. This is about Beowulf. I'm sorry, not Beowulf, Grendel. Greedy and grim, he grabbed 30 men from their resting places and rushed to his lair, flushed up and inflamed from the raid, blundering back with the butchered corpses. Well, that alliteration is very clear in that last line, right? Blundering back with the butchered corpses. But you can hear a couple of the other things here too. There is assonance there in that line, inflamed from the raid. A sound. There are lots of examples of these throughout the poem. And this is really important because this is kind of what makes poetry poetry. Poetry has a musical quality that you can actually enjoy and appreciate even if you don't understand the language that's being spoken, right? You don't have to understand Old English to hear alliteration, assonance, consonants, and so on. And something else that makes poetry different than regular prose is poetry loves to play with words, to have fun with words. And those kennings I mentioned a moment ago, an excellent example of that kind of playfulness with words, bringing together two words, creating new words to function as a metaphor for something. Okay, so hopefully this handout will help you be attuned for some of these musical qualities. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video, we talked about setting in terms of time and place. We've talked about the poetic qualities of Beowulf as an Anglo-Saxon poem. Finally, I want to say something about genre. And of course, I've kind of let the cat out of the bag already. It is an epic. So this is, in a sense, depending on how you count it, maybe the fourth epic that we've looked at in this class so far. Certainly, of course, the Odyssey and the Aeneid, but you can make an argument for Ovid's Metamorphoses as well. So you already know that an epic is a long narrative poem that has a hero or group of heroes. There's often a journey element, and in most cases there is a vast setting. So the hero goes to a number of different places, each of which tends to be sort of colorful and memorable. There are almost always supernatural elements in an epic. Now in Beowulf, this is different from, say, the Odyssey or the Aeneid, where you've got the gods acting as principal characters. You don't have that here, but you certainly have supernatural events. You often have, when it comes to the hero, the epic hero, an emphasis on his fighting abilities. You certainly have that here. And there's often a healthy dose of feasting and storytelling, and both of these are present in Beowulf. And I've already mentioned another element, too, that is very characteristic of epics, that they are set in a time that is sort of far distant in the past. So the author, somebody who's writing an epic is not writing about their contemporary world. They're writing about a world, sort of quasi-legendary world that existed far away in the past. Finally, maybe most importantly, epics, by definition, reflect and promote the values of the culture that produce them. And you're very familiar with this, right? Because you've thought about how the Odyssey reflects Greek values and how the Aeneid reflects Roman values. Beowulf is no different here. If you want to understand the values and ideals of Anglo-Saxon culture, particularly early Anglo-Saxon culture, this is a great poem to read. It will be highly informative. So that's one of our big questions. What do we learn about the culture of the early Germanic peoples in Scandinavia from reading this poem? And hopefully you've already taken a peek at your essay question for the week. The essay question is very much interested in this question as well. So that should be enough to kind of get you started. I think that you could go ahead and start reading Beowulf now, but I wouldn't wait too long to watch the second video, which will also help guide your reading.